Chapter 1 The Attack It was the holiday season of 1884-85. An ocean liner was receiving its cargo at a southern wharf. A stream of panting Negroes, bared to the waist, their black backs shining with perspiration, were pushing trucks piled high with casks, bales, and boxes. Beside this stream of humanity ran another, more noisy and less labored than the first, a stream of oaths from the overseer's mouth. The second stream increased in volume and in speed, as the first decreased, as though it were necessary to establish an equilibrium. A novel sight, this, but 3 days lay between my first term as a freshman in a Pennsylvania college and this, my first look into the life of a Southern city. Eager to drink in every detail, and careless of the flight of time, I seated myself upon a box and gazed upon the human stream in a fascinated, abstracted manner, as a child might gaze upon a tossing mountain torrent. At first I saw only generalities, but later I followed individuals. Among the throng of workmen, I at length espied one who interested me. Was it because of his youth? He seemed but a lad in his teens. Was it because his tall, lithe figure attracted particular notice even among so many stalwart forms? I could but notice that his truck, though often more heavily laden than the rest, was handled with the utmost ease. Was it because his skin was fairer than that of the other workmen? Elsewhere he might pass for an intelligent Caucasian. As I made these mental comments, he disappeared into the ship's hold. With empty truck, he was hastening down the gangway, when, seeming suddenly conscious of my gaze, he glanced toward me. Then, perhaps detecting more than usual interest in my face, he surveyed me with more earnestness, his countenance lighting up with an eagerness almost pitiful to see. But the expression of eagerness instantly gave place to one of horror. Unwittingly he had wandered from his course, bringing his truck into violent collision with one advancing from the opposite direction, overturning its burden and nearly capsizing its owner. To make matters worse, the following trucks crashed headlong into the overturned load. The overseer, wishing to make an example of the author of the mishap, smote heavily with his cane upon the Negro's bared back. Writhing with pain, the luckless fellow quickly succeeded in extricating his truck from the tangled mass, and by almost superhuman efforts replaced the overturned load, so that 3 minutes after the accident occurred, the line of trucks was moving as if nothing unusual had happened. The overseer, however, was not easily appeased. Having used his cane freely, his tongue flew yet more freely. "You blank nigger, delayin' the whole bunch by your stargazing. I'll break that blank back of yourn to teach you better than to hinder decent folks in their work. Out to church last night, was you? You double-faced, lying hypocrite. You nigger devil. I'll make you wish you was in hell rather than around extorting and praying and psalm singing." At this, some bystanders, anxious for a little excitement, joined in a chorus of jeers and taunts. All this was borne nervously but silently by the Negro, only a burning fire in his eyes showing that the shafts had struck home. As if to atone for the delay he had unintentionally caused, he now hurried to the far end of the wharf and piled his truck high with such a load as to cause me to exclaim with surprise. Then, carefully lifting the ponderous mass, he started for the steamer. Slowly it moved at first, Then, gathering speed as it proceeded, the truck passed the overseer halfway to the boat, with the Negro trotting rapidly. The overseer's malice had not subsided, and with another oath and threat he proceeded to kick the Negro all the way to the boat, enjoining him in no chaste language to see that he didn't repeat the disturbance. This unexpected attack could do but one thing to the top-heavy mass on the Negro's truck, and again the wharf was littered with trucks and boxes. At this, the overseer invoked upon the Negro all the curses of heaven and hell, and raised his cane to strike again the bruised and welted back. The blow never fell. Instead, a long arm shot out from the Negro's side, and the overseer fell as though struck by a dead weight. All is confusion. Oaths mingle with the sound of rushing feet. A dozen onlookers and loiterers surround the Negro, but goaded to fury by his unjust treatment, he repels all attacks with the ferocity of desperation. The other Negroes, frightened by the audacity of their companion, gaze for a moment upon the motionless form of the overseer, then quickly vanish. The crowd increases to a mob. "Get a rope!" cries one. "Nah, this is good enough for 'em," rejoins a lazy-looking loafer, drawing a revolver and taking deliberate aim at the Negro's head. "Don't shoot," says a friend, knocking up the revolver just as it goes off. "Bullets is too good for niggers. Roasting's better." The report of the revolver, joined with the angry yells of the mob, brings hundreds to the scene. It was strange where it came from, this mass of humanity, jostling, questioning, running, talking excitedly, hooting and hallooing. From every side, men came like wharf rats, driven from their hiding places by a fire. Loafers, boat hands, cabmen, newsboys, and the heterogeneous throng of those who happen to be on the street and are attracted by the unusual or exciting. They were all there, gesticulating wildly, calling hoarsely, cursing, half ignorant of the cause of the disturbance, but demanding at once that the Negro who so fearlessly held him at bay should be shot, burned, cut to pieces, hanged, torn limb from limb, or drowned, as their fancy dictated. At first it seemed as though the Negro would stand his ground, for none dared venture within the circle his swift blows had kept open around him. But as the pressure from without increases, the hollow in the center of the throng suddenly gives way, and the Negro is engulfed in a sea of hands clutching his throat, his arms, or tearing his already bleeding body. By an almost superhuman effort, he shakes them off. But one man, though he were an Hercules, cannot long resist 500, and his strength once spent, he is as unable to escape as a child under similar circumstances. One of the mob had secured a rope from a neighboring catboat, and with this they bound their victim's hands. The crowd meanwhile gave way and allowed him to be conducted by several of the coarsest and most brutal, the others falling in closely behind. I had stood as if rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the swiftness of the catastrophe, and dumb with fear for the Negro's life. "Where are they taking him?" I managed to ask of a loud-voiced, blatant fellow who was explaining what he'd do if he had the disposition of the nigger. "Why, stranger, I reckon they're only looking for an appropriate limb to thread 'em to." I shrugged my shoulders. "Look here, my friend," said I, "what has that poor Negro done that you or I would not have done under like provocation? Is he to be killed like a dog simply because he raised his hand in self-defense? If this is Southern justice, then I'm glad I live elsewhere." "Hey," said my interlocutor, "a nigger has no rights. They're getting too blank many anyhow. A nigger less now and then'll help to even things up." "Where are your officers?" I rejoined. "I don't know. I reckon that's Bill Sangerfield comin' yonder, but he won't get that there nigger, not alive." Sure enough, it was a squad of officers bearing down upon the mob. A short, sharp conflict ensued, the officers gaining possession of the prisoner but trying in vain to stem the human tide. Slowly the bluecoats managed to work their way to the side of the street, and then by a sudden dash, with the crowd yelling at their heels, bullets flying dangerously near, half dragging and half carrying the Negro, they rushed down an alley, pressed a teamster into service, and a few minutes later drew up, a pair of panting horses, at the jail door. By this time the crowd had grown to tremendous proportions. Fully 5,000 men, perhaps a quarter of the city's population, were howling about the prison doors. "Bring him out! Break the door in! Kill the officers if they resist! Fire the prison!" were the cries. Several, who were nearest the door, pushed against it, but found it too heavily barred to respond to their efforts. Finally, after a half-hour of inorganized attack, some men secured a plank and were about to batter the door down when it unexpectedly swung back, and Sangerfield himself, calm and unruffled, stepped out in full view of the throng. "Give up the nigger and we'll go," said a burly ruffian in the foreground. "Hand over the keys," shouted another. The sheriff held up his hand for silence. "Hear the sheriff! Let Bill have a chance!" came from many a mouth. And then, in a dead silence, the sheriff exclaimed deliberately, "Gentlemen, if you'd like to have the Negro that was taken in here about a half-hour ago, that's the boy. Give us the nigger," interrupted many voices at once. The sheriff proceeded as calmly as before. "If you want him, you'll have to go to the state capitol, for he left this place by the back door as you arrived at the front, and the train which he took left town 10 minutes ago." An angry howl went up from the mob. The prison door swung to heavily, the bolts flew into place, and the mob was baffled. Then fire was resorted to. Passion got the upper hand of judgment. Combustibles were collected, torches applied, red flames darted forth, increased in volume until they wrapped jail and courthouse in a lurid winding sheet. Then, as if satisfied with the havoc wrought, one by one, the perpetrators of the deed began to slink away into the darkness. Somehow, I felt that I was in a measure responsible for the strange events of the afternoon and evening. So unreal they seemed, that with difficulty I persuaded myself that it was not a dream. I could not think of that young mulatto suffering the horrors of the gallows or the stake for aught I knew, and he so devoid of offense. I must see him. I must aid him in some way. So thinking, I rushed to the wharf, secured my baggage, and hastened toward the depot to take the next train for the state capitol. Note: it must not be supposed that mob law is confined entirely to the South. The events of this chapter were duplicated by an occurrence in an Ohio town not 5 years ago. End of Section 1. Chapter 2. The Flight. As I walked along the wharf on my way to the train, my imagination ran riot, conjuring up every conceivable predicament in which I might be placed if I were to befriend the unfortunate roustabout. Had I been given time for calmer reflection, I doubtless would have taken less interest in the case. but the events of the evening were yet vivid in my mind, and it seemed to me then that it would be the height of injustice to suffer the fellow to be tried and condemned as a malicious felon, when there seemed to be plenty of evidence to the contrary. Perhaps I was the more interested because I had serious thought of making the profession of law my life work. Here was a case in which to gain my first practical knowledge of criminal law. I tortured myself with the thought that perhaps the news had been telegraphed to the capital, and another mob had been more successful than the first in their attempt to defeat the law. But then, I thought, possibly someone else had telegraphed the authorities, so that ample police protection had been afforded. Ah, who would be sufficiently thoughtful thus to telegraph when the sheriff and his posse were imprisoned in the burning building? Then a picture of the conflagration, with the encircling crowd gazing in silence at the havoc they had wrought, flashed again before my mind's eye. What should I do after I had reached the capital? My conjectures and forebodings made me unaware of a dark form lurking in the shadow of a warehouse. Before I could cry out or escape, a hand covered my mouth and a brawny arm encircled me so that struggle was in vain. I was drawn back into the shadow toward the water's edge. I expected to be thrown down and robbed, or pitched headlong into the dark water. But instead, a low voice, tremulous with excitement, said, "Oh, sir, you doesn't know me, no I you. Yet this afternoon when I seen you on the wharf, you looked sort of kind. I done got away from the officers and come down here, for it seemed powerful lonely here. I can't get out of the city without help, for I reckon every street am being watched by the regulators. Oh, sir, can't y'all help me get out of here?" He released my mouth as he spoke. I was too weak from fright to answer for a moment. Then I said quietly, "I will try." "I's well obliged," he said with evident relief. "Have you any old clothes here that I can put on?" he said. "Yes, here is a coat and cap which will serve that purpose," said I, opening my suitcase. "I'll tote y'all's satchel," he said, when he was arrayed in the novel attire. "That is, if I can do it and not rip this here coat up the back." As we stepped out into the light, the droll figure he cut with arms extending far beyond the sleeves and shoulders drawn well back proved too much for my risibilities, and I laughed outright. Northward, keeping near to the river, we went, at first moving cautiously and keeping in the shadow of the buildings as much as possible. But gathering confidence as we went, when we neared the city limits, we walked along quite unconcernedly, talking in low tones of our plans of escape. From the riverside we emerged upon a country road. Here we were stopped by a masked horseman, who demanded our names and destination. I told him that I was not in the habit of having to tell my name, that I had come to the city to see some of my friends who sent their man out to carry my satchel for me and show the way, that we had stopped to see the fire, and hence were late in getting started. "Tell that to someone what's easy," said the man with the mask. "But I'm D-blank sure I saw both you on the wharf this evening. You're my prisoners," said he, bringing his rifle to his shoulder. Turning suddenly sick with fear, I caught a glimpse of my companion clearing the roadside fence at a single leap. Instantly I followed. A bullet grazed my cheek. I heard the thud of the horse's hoofs as they struck the ground on my side of the fence. We were but 3 rods in advance, yet shielded by darkness. Another report from the rifle. My companion just in front of me stumbled and rolled over, but was up again before I was abreast of him. We seemed to be standing still in our flight. The breathing of the horse could be heard but a rod behind, and there was the sound of the approach of horses from all sides. Bushes here and there favored our flight. Hugging the river bank, we hurried on while the horses floundered more slowly after us. As I was abandoning hope, the ground over which we sped grew boggy. On up the river we fled with tired feet and fast-beating hearts, and ears strained to catch every sound of approaching danger. Through thick underbrush which tore our clothes and scratched our hands, through bogs into which we sank at every step. On we rushed, now running, now leaping from place to place, and again walking when too exhausted to run more. Every snapping of twigs, every rustling of leaves added to our fear. The very moon seemed to mock us. The stars laughed sleepily at us, as if confident of our capture. As moon and stars began to fade, and the first streaks of gray glimmered in the east, we stumbled upon something hidden in a clump of bushes. A boat. We were too tired to shout, and we would not have dared if strength had remained. Our hopes ran high. For the first time since we had been pursued, did we venture to speak. "Now, if we can only find the oars," said I. My sentence was not finished. "Listen," said my companion, putting his hand to his ear. I listened intently in the direction in which he turned, and I heard a faint baying miles away. "Bloodhounds," said he, with yet deeper fear written on his face. "Here's a paddle," he exclaimed, drawing one from underneath the boat. "No time to look for oars now. Just help me push the boat down." In a moment we were off, the mist from the river hiding our movements. Starting in a diagonal direction, we intended to cross to a point a mile or so upstream. But once out in the river, our movements became uncertain because of the mist. It was with difficulty that we made our way across, guided as we were largely by the current. On reaching the opposite shore, we skirted the bank at a safe distance, proceeding upstream for 2 or 3 miles, as we supposed. When the mists began to rise, we drew up at a point which seemed deserted, and, setting the boat adrift that it might not betray our landing place, we proceeded again on foot. Taking care to keep at a safe distance from the shore to escape the notice of any pursuers on the other side, we plodded on, discussing the various methods of escape. "Well," said I, trying hard to appear cheerful, "fortune has favored us thus far, and if she doesn't go back on us now, we'll be all right." He turned a despairing face upon me. "You all can get away, but not with me. I'll help's far as I can, but when we gets where folks sees us, y'all be better off alone. I's 'stremely 'bliged for your assistance, but 'tain't no use no longer. I'll tote y'all's case to near yonder house," designating a small farmhouse just coming into view. "They'll go with you to the train, and den the Norf'em not powerful far away. By and by the news come dere's one colored man less." "No," I thundered, turning upon him so fiercely that he started in surprise. "I told you last night I'd help you, and whatever other faults I may have, no one knows me for a confounded liar. If you are captured, they'll have to take me too." His face brightened, and a new vigor seemed to come into his frame. Tears rushed to his eyes, and bore silent witness to his gratitude. Then I noticed for the first time that blood was oozing from his left arm near the shoulder. An old handkerchief tied thereabout was saturated and stiff with blood. "It's just a tetch," said he. Well, I guess we'll have to fix you up a bit before we get out among folks. You aren't in first-class condition to stand the fatigue of walking, either," I said solicitously. He then proposed that we go into the woods or swamps, sleep until night, and travel under cover of darkness. To this I did not agree, claiming that our safety lay in haste rather than in seclusion. I then bandaged the arm as carefully as I could with fresh handkerchiefs. "For the time being, you'd better act as my servant whenever we're anywhere to be seen," said I at length. and I'll put up a bluff that we've been on a fishing excursion and that I took you along to help carry stuff. We got lost from the rest of the party and have been tramping around all morning trying to find them. I'll make inquiries as to whether they've been seen, and then try to hire some farmer to take us to the nearest town, where we may catch a train." At the first farm, we failed to find anyone around. I was so ravenously hungry that I favored looting the pantry, but to this my companion objected, begging me not to lay myself liable to arrest by anything done on this side of the river. I listened to his entreaties, and we trudged on. Near the next house we found an old man busy in the field. To him I told my tale with seeming success, for he went with us to the house, and while we ate a hot breakfast prepared by his good wife, there never was another such breakfast in all the realms of culinary achievement, he made ready the horses and wagon, and we were soon jolting away on our 15-mile ride to the depot. Fortunately, the bed of the wagon was filled with straw, and an old blanket screened us from the fierce heat of the sun while we slept. When I at last awoke, the wagon had come to a standstill, and I heard voices near at hand. My companion was still asleep, and I did not have the heart to disturb him. As the noises from without did not sound threatening, I ventured to sit upright and look about. It was a Four Corners, with perhaps a dozen houses in sight. Our wagon was drawn up before the only store. While the horses were drinking from the dirty-looking trough, the farmer was bickering with the storekeeper for a lunch. Seized by a sudden idea, I too joined the group, and eagerly priced several articles more or less desirable. I procured for myself 2 canvas hunting jackets and caps, and a shotgun with several rounds of ammunition. I then explained to the farmer that if our companions rallied me about getting lost, that I'd have some big stories fixed up about a hunting expedition and what I shot. He took it as a good joke and laughed heartily. The depot was but 3 miles from here. My companion woke up in time to don his hunting outfit and take charge of the gun, which I was careful to instruct him how to handle, keeping up a continuous flow of small talk the while so as to cover the seriousness of our intent. At the edge of the village where we were to take the train, we dismissed our hospitable farmer with a generous greenback and hearty thanks for his service. I considered that we would attract less attention and encounter less suspicion if we walked to the depot than if we were carried there in the wagon. But this precaution came near proving our undoing. Everywhere we were the center of curious eyes. Our equipment seemed to be somewhat novel and excited much comment. As we neared the depot, we were unexpectedly confronted by an officer bidding us halt in the name of the law. For answer, my companion brought the gun quickly to his shoulder. Checking his hasty movement by my hand, I demanded in as calm a tone as I could muster, "On what charge do you halt us?" "I do not halt you, but your servant, as a lawbreaker." Then, noting my puzzled look, he added, "You know, we don't allow niggers to carry firearms through town, and this fellow's action just now proves the wisdom of the law. If we didn't regulate the action of niggers a little, no white person would dare walk the street." "Oh, well," said I, conciliatorially. "You see, we're both strangers here. We were off on a hunting trip down by the river, and got lost from our party. Blamed if we haven't been having the greatest luck. We thought if we didn't get a shot at anything else, we might try one on an escaped nigger. And now, after getting lost and not having a chance to empty our gun at anything, to be arrested for carrying a gun seems to cap the climax. Come, my man, let Jim off this time. He's a trifle to remember us by. Please don't add to our bad luck." The man seemed to appreciate the humor of the situation, and our evident perturbation stirred his risibilities still more. He chuckled uneasily and seemed half disposed to let the matter pass. "Will it be all right if I carry the gun the rest of the way through town?" said I, growing uneasy as several people began to come toward us. "Certainly. We never object to white folks carrying guns. It's only niggers." As we hurried on our way to the depot, we heard him remark to some of the curious who had now overtaken him, "That fellow's been having hunter's luck." At the depot, during what seemed an interminable waiting for the train's arrival, we were several times questioned by idlers who had somehow learned that we tried to get a shot at the runaway nigger. To reply, I invented 2 or 3 colossal lies, and then, fearing lest some slip might betray us both, I lapsed into silence, saying only to the various inquiries, "We've been hunting, you see, and we've had hard luck." A fellow that's had hard luck doesn't want to talk much about it. At the depot, I secured a city paper, and then for the first time I learned the particulars of the escape, colored only as a newspaper can color the truth. Under flaring headlines that occupied about 1/3 of the first page, I read, "It seems that our fair city is just awakening to the fact that it has been the victim of a deep-laid conspiracy, hatched without doubt by some of the most brutal and ignorant Negroes of the place, and executed by means of a large number of accomplices. Notable among these conspirators was an unknown white man who was undoubtedly a shameful anarchist from the North, seeking to excite an uprising among the blacks. His actions did not awaken suspicion at first, but it has been learned from eyewitnesses that it was at a given signal from him that the Negro roustabout yesterday upset another fellow's truck, and thus precipitated upon him the just discipline of the overseer. The second mix-up was due to the same cause, and when our honored citizen, the overseer of the gang, became indignant at a deliberate repetition of the offense and the consequent delay, the Negro only carried out the next step of a concerted arrangement, by brutally striking the overseer and all but murdering him. It was undoubtedly intended that the murderous Negro should escape by way of the river before a crowd could gather, but here the carefully laid plan failed. Before the escape was possible, a throng of public-spirited citizens was upon the offender, and swift justice, the cheapest and most rational justice in all such cases, would have been visited had not some representatives of the law proved themselves obnoxiously overzealous. As for the arch-conspirator, our naive innocence permitted him to mingle unsuspected among the throng that followed the prisoner to the courthouse. He even ventured to question, we are told, our methods of administering justice, but his remarks passed unheeded in the excitement of the hour. Unmolested, the red-handed, deep-dyed villain stood among honest citizens, complacently watching the hungry flames kindled by his fellow conspirators lick up our beautiful public buildings. Unmolested, he took his departure while the work of havoc went wildly on. In the meantime, the base tool of the baser conspirator, while being conveyed to the depot for transportation to the state capital, jumped from the wagon and eluded his captors. It was not until later in the evening, when the 2 men were seen together near the outskirts of the city, and were stopped by one of our patriotic and heroic guards, that the full extent of the plot began to be realized. A posse of men, afterwards reinforced by bloodhounds, went in hot pursuit, but after following the scent for some distance along the bank, the hounds were baffled. It is thought that some of their confederates had arranged for a boat to conduct them away under cover of darkness. Several Negroes who are suspected of complicity in the plot have been hanged or otherwise disposed of this morning. Our best citizens seem determined to make a clean sweep of the conspirators, and several others may swing before another sunrise. A description of the Negro and myself followed, and some drawings sufficiently grotesque to make me laugh in spite of the many eyes which were upon me. The statement was made and emphasized repeatedly that Seeger, the overseer who was struck, would never leave our trail until both of us were captured or shot. I noted that the Negro was said to be nearly naked, and the strange white man was said to be dressed in a business suit with steamer cap. Both of the men appeared to be unarmed, so far as the newspaper reporter was able to determine, and this was said to be a clever artifice to aid in avoiding suspicion in case of capture. As evening drew on, the long-expected train rolled in, and all was confusion until I had Jim safely stowed away in a Jim Crow car with a ticket for Philadelphia in his hand, while I sought the Pullman, soon to forget the adventures of the past 24 hours in sleep. End of Section 2. Section 3 of Stanton White, A Romance of the New South, by Asa Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Recaptured. I awoke to find that the porter had been trying vainly to arouse me for some time. It was after 8 o'clock, and I looked from my car window upon the mountains of Virginia, glinted here and there by dew-laden herb and bush, and flecked by patches of sunlight. I was ordering a hearty breakfast when I chanced to remember my companion of the former night. I had given him no money with which to purchase food. Starting to find him, I learned to my dismay that the Jim Crow car had been detached during the night as the train began to ascend some heavy grades, and that the car would follow by a slower train. At first I was much exercised over the separation from my ward, but my breakfast was waiting, and my stiffened muscles courted the ease of the soft cushions. I yielded to the bodily indulgence, while my anxiety decreased in proportion as my bodily comfort increased. By the time breakfast was over, I began to take quite a complacent view of the whole matter. Oh well, I thought, he's so accustomed to shifting for himself that it will not be much of a hardship to be thrown on his own resources in a strange city. As for a little privation, he will not know the difference 100 years from now. I've gotten him safely away from his pursuers. I've even risked my own life and comfort in so doing. Indeed, I may have offended my father's boyhood friend, Mr. Essen, at whose invitation I was to have spent my Christmas vacation in his Florida home. But had I the assurance that my ward was entirely out of danger? I had left him unarmed, penniless, wounded, in a crowded, dirty car. Here I must have dozed, for the next I knew, the waiter was tapping me on the shoulder and wishing to know what I'd have for lunch. Once I thought of getting off the train and awaiting the arrival of the Jim Crow car, but I realized that this would mean delay and financial loss for me. Accordingly, I decided to look for him after I arrived in Philadelphia. But there, amid the many trains and throngs of people, I soon lost hope of discovering him. Arrived at college, I watched the papers for a few days, but saw no notice of his recapture. Then I dismissed the subject entirely from my mind. The school year sped uneventfully. I did not distinguish myself greatly in my studies. What was the use of grinding when so many pleasures were available? I wrote a lengthy letter to Mr. Essen, explaining fully my strange vacation experience, and begging him to pardon the suspense and anxiety I must have caused him by allowing myself to be diverted from my long-cherished purpose. Receiving no reply, I concluded that I had offended either by a bungling expression of regret or by the seeming slight to my would-be host's hospitality. I began to almost wish that I had turned a deaf ear to the roustabout's entreaties. He, a stranger, had no right to expect me to give up my plans in order to lend him assistance. I did not know even his name. I was not usually in so generous a mood, and that I had been willing to thaw so easily was a cause for much wonder on my part. But even as I reproached myself for what seemed like foolish gullibility, the picture of the lone, hunted, desperate, yet manly fellow whom I had aided came to mind. I remembered how he had pleaded with me to leave him and save myself, and how uncomplainingly he had borne his hardships and even his wounds. Ashamed of my selfishness in harboring anything but the most generous feeling, I repeatedly put the whole subject from my thoughts. and so far succeeded in dismissing it from my mind, that as the spring with its outdoor sports and its promise of a summer's rest drew on, I found the circumstances of the last vacation taking on an element of unreality. The end of the school year was fast approaching, when I was surprised one day to receive a letter from Mr. Esson. It was seemingly prompted by the kindliest feeling. He regretted my failure to visit him, and hinted delicately that he had not been without concern for my safety. He most cordially and hospitably renewed his invitation to me to visit him whenever my convenience might dictate. Then followed a section which greatly excited me. It read, "I am glad that if it were necessary for me to be denied the pleasure of a visit from you, it was for no less commendable a service than that which you undertook. My only regret is that, like too many other good works, this service did not go quite far enough to accomplish its object." I was watching the papers with some anxiety to discover, if possible, a cause for your delay in coming. The papers were full of accounts of this runaway Negro. I followed the account of the burned public buildings and the escape of the suspected incendiary, as well as a long, drawn-out description of the part played by the unknown villain from the North. The next day they reported no progress in the case, but the following day the papers blazed with headlines telling of the Negro's recapture. It seemed that he was caught on board a northbound train. Detectives employed by Seeger, the overseer, identified him by his clothes, but they had no opportunity to even notify their employer. The arrest caused sufficient commotion to attract a crowd, and then it was all up with the Negro. No chance for escape this time. In vain he protested his innocence, claiming that he was the victim of some horrible mistake. They hurried him to a neighboring pile of neglected railroad ties, and there they roasted him alive. While he writhed and screamed in agony, his executioners looked placidly on. As his limbs began to char, and the fire abated slightly, eager souvenir hunters slashed off pieces of fingers and toes, while others contented themselves with links of the chain which held him to the funeral pyre. Seeger was the only one not satisfied with the procedure. He expressed the opinion that the nigger was too slippery by a D-blank sight to be caught and executed without a struggle. He refused to pay the detectives for the capture, and gave it out as his intention to travel from ocean to ocean and from pole to pole until he was assured of the right nigger's death. That I was profoundly impressed as well as surprised by the contents of this letter need not be said. I now saw clearly how lax I had been in carrying out what I had recognized as a duty. How different might have been the outcome if I had but used a little precaution. Just a little carelessness had rendered unavailing all my good intentions and danger-fraught comradeship. To some extent, I felt blood-guilty. Calmer reflection told me that I was not altogether at fault. I assured myself that if this unhappy experience only taught me greater care in the performance of known duty, I should not feel poorly repaid. End of Section 3. Section 4 of Stanton White, A Romance of the New South, by Asa Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. School Days. It were natural to suppose that the discovery of such a moral precept, and especially one so dearly bought, might exert a salutary influence on my school life for the remainder of the year. Such was not the case, however. To recognize the desirability of a certain course I found to be far different from pursuing such a course with unremitting diligence. Social events, fraternity functions, out-of-door sports, all attracted me and held me with their spell. Life in its more serious aspect faded into indistinct outlines, and the summer vacation found me a little more cynical, possessing a little less respect for myself and a little less sympathy for others. Thus, instead of enriching my life, as I had at first vaguely hoped, my trying experience tended rather to impoverish me. I need not here record the aimless and useless summer vacation I passed. Considering that my position as a college student exempted me from manual toil, I dawdled and idled away my vacation, sitting in hammocks, playing an occasional game of tennis or croquet, lounging for a week or two at a popular summer resort, until my father's slender resources compelled him to call a halt upon my continued needless expenses. At home, I found fault with the simple ways and tastes of my devoted parents and sister. The nearby town had become slow to my cultivated tastes. My old-time associates had become stupid and uncongenial. "Mary," said my father to mother one day, as I lolled, half dozing in the hammock, just within earshot of the kitchen. "Mary, it seems that you've always hankered about sending our son to college. I ain't no ways complaining, but before he went away to school, he used to help me sometimes, if he wasn't off on some kind of a frolic. But now, I don't see but he feels above working. Leastwise, that's the way it looks." "Henry," said my mother, "I little thought you would be so harsh in judging our son. Can't you see that the poor boy is just tired to death with his studies? That's what the vacation is for, to give him a chance to rest." My father mumbled something about the harvest field being restful to brain workers, and then vanished in the direction of the barn. I turned over and settled myself for another nap, and paid no more attention to the incident, only to allow it to go in with a vast accumulation of unhappy circumstances to render me more discontented. So the time dragged wearily on. With a sigh of relief, I hailed the return of autumn. College would soon open, and then at least I would be free to follow my own tastes and inclinations. A few days before I left for college, my father called me to the parlor for a farewell conference. "Well, son," said he, "it's costing us a heap of money to send you to school. I hope you think you're getting your money's worth." He paused for a moment, as if half expecting a reply, but as I proffered none, he proceeded. "A heap of money. More'n we could afford if we hadn't been planning ahead, ever since you was in knee pants. Your mother and I have set a lot of store by seeing you through college, and we want you to go through right. Whatever is right and proper as to expenses, we're willing to stand. About how much will it take for this year? No, don't answer now, but figure it up, kind of close and accurate like, and hand me the figuring so's we can know what to depend on." The next day I handed him what I considered a liberal expense account. He made a check for $300 more than my estimate. "We don't care about our boy being skimped," he said, with a touch of pride. "We want him to go through just as well as the other fellows." I thanked him perfunctorily, pocketed the check, and the next day left for college. The extra $300, I reasoned, would easily enable me to attend a few more plays, smoke a better brand of cigars, and dress a little better. It was not so dull in the college town as at home. I was 3 days early, but already the trains were beginning to bring in students, new ones, mostly, who were eager to get acquainted and settled ere the school year began. I took a languid interest in their enthusiasm and active preparations for work. Then the old students began to arrive. Those of disposition similar to my own I welcomed, and we soon started upon a round of pleasure and dissipation. A year passed thus, and yet another, until the beginning of my last year at length arrived. One thing was a matter of pride with me. I gloried in the record of our college in athletics. Robust lads from rural districts found themselves well fitted for college sport. Their hardened muscles and stalwart frames needed but little training, and produced astonishing results under discipline, While I sat in my smoke-beclouded room playing cards and devising new ways of shirking school duties, these fellows were learning football tactics and were filling their lungs with oxygen and their brains with purified blood. It was rumored that autumn, in football circles, that considerable good material had been secured from the freshman class, and that among them, one big guard was likely to make a star. I used to go down to watch the practice occasionally when my crowd was not on hand to play cards. It was a real pleasure to watch White, the star guard. He seemed to have himself so well in hand. Tall, muscular, dark-complected, straight as a pine tree. The very Athenians might have envied him his physique. His intelligent face lit up with such a genuine enthusiasm as he entered into the game that he seemed to remind me somehow of what I myself might have been, had I applied myself to any worthy task with one half the devotion he showed for the gridiron. His classmates spoke highly of his intellectual work as well. I began to envy him. Would that I had my college course before me and were fresh and vigorous from the farm. How I'd like to live my college days all over again. But no, I could not now retreat. With muscles and morals weakened by dissipation, with willpower gone and intellect befogged, I had no choice but to drift. Guards Back was a new play with us that year. Our coach devised it so that White's individual work might count. It was the first game of the season. White had made 2 magnificent gains, and the ball was near our opponent's goal. Just before the ball was snapped for what was expected to be the scoring run, and while the formation line was still unbroken, the opposing guard struck White such a blow as to blind him for the moment. He fumbled the ball, and it went to the other side. With the blood streaming from his nose, White called the attention of the referee to the foul, but the latter claimed not to have seen it. Calmly and with remarkable self-possession, White took his place. The end of the game was at hand, and neither side had scored. By small gains and round-the-end runs, we had forced the ball, little by little, down the field, until now we were on our opponent's 10-yard line. Twice the halfbacks were tried with no gain. Then the command comes sharp and distinctly, "Guards back!" White's signal is given. With well-formed interference, he dashes forward. The opposition, however, is not taken unaware. Before 5 yards is traversed, the interference is broken, and White goes down only to roll over and get up 3 yards from the goal. As he rises, a cowardly blow is struck. He reels forward, totters, falls. No, he staggers on. 1 step, 2 steps, then sinks under half a dozen heavyweights. A moment of anxious waiting as the prostrate players rise one by one. Then a shout rends the air. Hats, canes, umbrellas are thrown, pennants waved, and everyone goes wild, for the ball was 6 inches over the line. But why doesn't White get up? One of his comrades tries to assist him, but the head falls back. The face is bloodless. The surgeon applies restoratives. White languidly opens his eyes. Then the wrath of the crowd breaks forth. "Mob the villain that struck White! Mob the whole team!" were the cries. White, by a tremendous effort, raised his head and supported it on his hand. "I'll be all right soon," he faltered. "Don't raise a disturbance." The whistle blew for the lineup. White reeled to his place. Then time was called, and the game was ours. The crowd rushed in and carried White in triumph on their shoulders. And from that time, his self-control, his pluck, his personal prowess became the pride and talk of town and college. As I went to my room after the game, I fell to contrasting White's action, when so shamefully treated, with the action under similar circumstances of a friendless mulatto, whose presence still seemed to dog me occasionally. Had White struck his opponent, scarcely a witness would have blamed him, though for the same offense a colored man had paid the penalty with his life. If White had not possessed the advantages of careful training and helpful home surroundings, his passion would doubtless have had as little restraint as those of the roustabout, I concluded. I began to wonder, in a lazy fashion, and without at first caring to satisfy my wondering, by what process White had arrived at such marvelous self-control. I tried to imagine his home surroundings, his former education, and thus my curiosity became thoroughly aroused. I resolved to get acquainted with White. Not intimately, just sufficiently acquainted so that I might elicit the information for which I seemed to have a morbid interest. Accordingly, I sought him out. It could not be considered otherwise than an honor to be on speaking terms with one of the most popular men in college, I told myself. Strange to say, I received no rebuff. He did not seem to suspect my covert intent, and seemed to take my advances kindly. Without scarcely understanding why I did so, I invited him to spend the Christmas vacation with me at my home. Here he showed himself so agreeable and tactful that he was immediately lionized by the community. His presence, though acting as somewhat of a restraint upon my usual dilatoriness, served, nevertheless, to render my home-going almost enjoyable. Returning to college, I found that, silently, though surely, his influence was proving to help me. I began to visit his room with greater frequency. The purpose which led me to seek his acquaintance was all but forgotten, and I came to appreciate him for what he then was, not for what his past training had been. Often, in my visits to his room, I found another visitor, a classmate of White's, named Jenkins. The only prominent feature possessed by Jenkins was his nose. This was unusually long and was turned up at the point, reminding one, not a little, of the nose of that quadruped, which betrays its innate curiosity by rooting. Jenkins had plenty of curiosity. The day I was introduced to him, he quizzed me somewhat as follows. "How do you spell your name, Mr. Edson? In what class are you? You are somewhat older than Mr. White and myself, I suppose. Might I ask how— but what was I going to say? Oh, yes. Where is your home? Near Rome? Oh, dear me. You came all the way across the water to blank? But how far is it?" I explained that I lived near Rome, New York, and abruptly made my escape. Jenkins had small, deep-set eyes and a sallow complexion. I learned that his mission to White's room was no less philanthropic than to secure all the assistance possible from White, because of the latter's good class standing. "White," he would say, with the utmost show of friendliness, "if I only had your capable mind, I might blank. How do you ever remember things the way you do? If I could only apply myself to one thing blank. But you know, I inherited a roving disposition from my aunt. She started in as a lady of leisure and ended blank. What was I saying? Oh, yes. If you please, Mr. White, won't you translate my Latin for me? I know I can never get it in the world. So good of you. Now, if you will work this problem, I shall feel that I can never repay you." At first I was vexed when White refused to take a hand in games of chance, and when he exhibited a preference for the study table, rather than the theater. Yet withal he was so earnest, so enthusiastic over his college work, that his companionship must necessarily either repel or inspire me. It did the latter, for I could not hate him. Still, I had no ambition to shine in the classroom. It was so much easier to slide through examination and recitation by horsing, cribbing, and resorting to all manner of dishonest methods. White's frequent visits to my room seemed to awaken a long-dormant sense of honor within me. His manliness did for me what my own weak will had never accomplished. The change was so gradual that I did not at first notice it. But our old Greek professor recognized my improvement before I myself did. One day I gave a hard-wrought, correct translation of a difficult passage. Kai commended me freely. I shall never forget it, nor cease to thank him for his kind words. Praise for honest work was something so new and strange that it created an epoch in my life. I began to apply myself with new vigor. Old companions began to drop me one by one. My evenings found me busy with my books. Fresh air instead of tobacco smoke filled my room. I burned the midnight oil. For a while, the advancement which I sought so eagerly seemed to elude me. The steady grind, with so little apparent result, discouraged me. But for White, I would have given up in despair. His presence and example, his cheerful words and ready sympathy gave me encouragement and fresh impetus. He viewed life from a different standpoint than did I. Defeat was not in his vocabulary. His stalwart inflexibility saved me. By and by I gained a vantage ground whence I could look backward and say, "There has been progress," forward and say, "There is hope." The end of the year was at hand. At White's suggestion, I competed for a place on the Emmett Prize debate. The profession for which I was preparing, said he, would demand that I be an adept in debate. He considered that the prize debate offered an opportunity for me to set a new standard of proficiency for myself. The subject of the debate interested me. Resolved, that education offers the best solution for the race problem in the South. I read, thought, drilled, until the argument seemed to be a part of myself. White assisted me with untiring energy. He gave me new thoughts and valuable suggestions after I had come to believe that I knew thoroughly every argument and every avenue of approach to the subject. From the preliminary debate, I was chosen as one of the speakers for the final public appearance. I chose the affirmative side. The negative won, but I was too deeply interested to permit a decision of a board of judges to change my views or dampen my ardor. Accordingly, I proposed to White, who had now become an almost inseparable companion, that we together visit the South and together study the question first-handed. I told him of Mr. Esson's cordial invitation, and assured him that he himself would be welcome if he chose to accompany me thither. I explained that my studious habits had proved of financial benefit to me, for I had managed to save $400 out of my yearly allowance. This, I told him, would pay the way for us both if we were careful in our expenditures. White did not receive my proposition with as much favor as I had expected. He concluded by saying, "I must have time to consider this matter. Commencement week is at hand. Final examinations demand my attention. I'll bear the matter in mind and give you my decision at the earliest possible moment. I warn you, however, not to count too much on my accompanying you, inasmuch as I fear that I may be obliged to seek employment in order to be provided with funds for the coming school year." End of Section 4. Chapter 5. A Distinguished Visitor. Visitors are many at commencement season. Class reunions, friendship and kinship, fraternity functions, and the general festivities attract many to the halls of their alma mater. Among those who were to visit our college that year was one held in high repute by the faculty and abjectly reverenced by the younger students, while we older students worshipped from afar. A self-made man was he. Never did he enjoy so much as an academic training, but with the advent of wealth had come, happily, a liberal disposition. Various religious bodies and educational institutions had profited by his bounty. Our university was indebted to him for an endowment of 5 millions. His busy life precluded any but hurried and infrequent visits. Our class deemed it a special honor that he had chosen the day of our graduation for his visit. A telegram told the hour of his arrival. We prepared to give him an ovation. A carriage was hired, the finest the city could afford. We decorated it gaily with our class colors. A ribbon-bedecked rope, held by ribbon-bedecked members of the graduating class, served instead of harness and horses. At an early hour, we betook ourselves with our equipage to the station. A brass band preceded us in the march. The whole town was agog. Students, professors, citizens, street Arabs, loafers, thronged the available space around the depot. As the train slowed down at the station, our class president was aboard in a trice, and greeted heartily, though with marked deference, a stout, gray-bearded man who appeared upon the platform of the last Pullman. Instantly the air was rent with cheer upon cheer. Class yells, college yells, the blare of the band playing "Hail to the Chief," shouts, waving of handkerchiefs and hats, created a demonstration which seemed at once to surprise and disconcert the great man. With due courtesy, however, he bowed his acknowledgment to the assembled throng, and, not without protest, allowed himself to be drawn in triumph to the president's mansion, where he was to be entertained. The crowds were so dense that the procession could move but slowly. Yet this gave us an opportunity to enjoy to the full the hours of our pride. All traffic in the streets was suspended. Even business itself seemed to be at a standstill. Every window, every balcony was full of eager faces. We were at once awed and rejoiced by our new dignity. Space was annihilated. We trod on air. At length, all too soon, our destination was reached. The carriage was brought to a standstill in front of the president's mansion. College and class yells were again given, then a speech was called for. Our benefactor seemed somewhat agitated by this demand, but he rose in the carriage and bowed. I was standing near the carriage, and noticed for the first time that the face was not remarkably intelligent. The white beard gave him a somewhat venerable appearance, but the white beard did not seem to harmonize with the somewhat sandy hair of the now uncovered head. His face bore marks of what in another I would have pronounced dissipation. A heretofore unnoticed scar above the left eye stood out vividly as the excitement of the moment blanched his face, and then drove the blood more freely to it. It seemed to me somehow that I had seen the face before, though I could not tell where. A deep silence, almost oppressive, preceded his words. He spoke. "Friends and fellow citizens." Glances of amazement were exchanged among the listeners. "I don't know as I exactly understand what all this here is about, but I'll say that I've been on the road for right at 4 year, and I never was treated in such style before, never. It may be that some mistake has been made." Here he paused and looked about dubiously. "Oh," and here a happy thought seemed to strike him. "It may be that the fame of my goods has arrived before me. Kentuck Red Ribbon Rye makes a famous drink for sure. Step up, boys. The drinks is on me." So speaking, he opened 2 sample cases and began to pour the sparkling liquid with celerity. I looked about me. The crowd was melting away. Considerable laughter was indulged in by those on the outskirts of the crowd, but the most of the students sneaked off in silence. Halfway across the campus, I paused and looked back. A little group, composed no doubt of loafers with a sprinkling of students, had surrounded the carriage and were intent upon making the most of the circumstances which placed the fiery beverage within their reach. Our class president was approaching along the campus path. I waited for him. "How did it happen?" said I. "Why, hang it all," said he. I had never seen the man I was to meet. Of course I had seen pictures enough of him, and I thought I'd know him anywhere. "This fellow resembles the pictures I've seen of C. and well, you know the rest. I guess I've made the mistake of my life." My parents spent commencement day with me. Mother had brought a basket of roses from the old farm, and such roses. I knew how painstakingly she and my sister had cared for them. I began to feel that I had never appreciated my mother before. The evening train took father and mother back to the farm again, but not before I had unfolded to them my plans of visiting the South. I met with no opposition. Father seemed gratified that I had saved some of my yearly stipend, while Mother smiled patiently and said that she hoped I'd get thoroughly rested before I settled down to practice law. She thought that a complete change, such as I contemplated, might prove beneficial. The only question yet unsettled was whether or not White would accompany me. He had been so very busy of late that I had not urged upon him the desirability of an early decision. I was a little more confident of a favorable decision than I was previously, as I climbed the maple-lined path to the dormitory that evening after accompanying my parents to the train. Had he not that day received the award of $50 for the Oxford Declamation Prize and $60 for the Reynolds Essay Prize? Surely these funds would assist him in his financial straits. As I approached the dormitory, a feeling of loneliness stole over me. The place wore an air of desertion, many of the students having left on the afternoon and evening trains. I was to tread those familiar halls no more. No more was I to hear the familiar voices, nor see the familiar faces. Gone were my school days. My heart was as lonely as the cheerless old building. Dear old dorm. Tender memories entwine thee as closely as the ivy thy somber gray walls. I knocked loudly at White's door. The sound echoed along the empty halls. No response. All was silent. Emerging from the building, I could just distinguish, through the gathering gloom, White coming up the path. "Well, old man," said I as soon as he was within earshot, "I've been looking for you. I want to congratulate you upon your good work. It's an honor to take one prize, but you seem to have been doubly honored today. 2 prizes and an enviable football record is enough to turn the head of many a man. I really believe it would spoil me, but you seem to be calm enough." He laughed a little and said, "Edson, I've been having so much else to think about this afternoon that my honors have not had time to greatly elate me. I have been out for a little walk along the college hill, while considering some matters that relate to my future. Some of them may interest you. Without doubt, you are anxious to know whether I can accompany you upon your trip southward. It is needless for me to tell how much I'd enjoy doing so. In fact, it would be more than a pleasure. It would furnish me with a long-sought rest. For the past 4 years, I have worked almost incessantly. For 2 years, I attended school in New York, working at odd times as a trained nurse. Previously, I served my apprenticeship as an orderly in a Philadelphia hospital. Of course, a respite would be appreciated, but I am strong, and I believe that I can endure a postponement of my vacation." "But what earthly need is there of your doing so? said I, quite testily. "Why, if you press me for an answer, I must say that, as an uninvited guest, I feel a trifle delicate about foisting myself upon Mr. Esson. If you had invited me to a camping expedition, in which I could assume half the responsibility and half the expense, I might feel differently. But—" "Why not make it a camping expedition, then?" I interrupted. "Why not?" he repeated. "The very thing. I expected that we'd have to resort to something of the kind before we accomplished our purpose. That's just what we'll do, old chap. When can we start?" "Not so fast, Edson. Why, you'll be hustling me off tonight, won't you?" "We can't start too soon to suit me. I'd get a bad case of the blues if I had to remain long in this deserted old dorm." "Well, I have a few business matters to adjust, and all my packing to do. I cannot possibly start before tomorrow evening." "Tomorrow evening it is," said I, decisively. End of Section 5. Section 6. Florida Hoe. Who should turn up at the train the next evening but Jenkins? Calmly he announced his decision to accompany us to Florida. "You see," he explained, "that roving disposition which I inherited from my aunt simply drove me down here tonight." I secretly pronounced anathemas upon his aunt and his whole ancestry. Turning, I saw a yellow mongrel dog at my heels. I vented my wrath in a kick that sent him howling across the street, with Jenkins following more quickly than gracefully. I had not noticed the dog chain attached to Jenkins' wrist. "Why, doggone it, Mr. Edkins!" Jenkins always twisted names in some outlandish manner. "You have given my dog a severe fright." "Your dog? What in the name of all the shades of the Romans are you doing with a mongrel, stub-tailed yellow cur?" "He is a hunter," said Jenkins, with as much dignity as he could command. "A hunter? I believe he is. At any rate, he has just led you a merry chase," and I laughed volubly at the figure Jenkins had cut. "How can we get rid of Jenkins?" said I, aside, to White. "Oh, let him go. Poor fellow. He has flunked his exams, and I don't blame him for wishing to go off somewhere. About the first wildcat we encounter will send Jenkins home a much frightened chap." I could not understand White's forbearance, but I decided that if White could stand Jenkins' company, I could. "What, Jenkins? You're not going to take your dog along?" exclaimed White, as the subject of our conversation was making for the baggage room. "Of course. The gentleman I bought him from said that the dog was a first-class— or, what was I going to say? Oh, yes. He said that the dog would be a necessity where there were wildcats and alligators." White smiled. "They do say that alligators are fond of yellow dogs," said I, viciously. Jenkins grew a shade paler, if that were possible. "Don't you think, Mr. White, that he will be useful on a— oh, doggone it, what was I going to say? I gave $10 for him, and— Here, Tiger! Here, Tiger!" At the sight of a Maltese kitten on a neighboring back fence, the dog had torn loose from Jenkins and was streaking in the opposite direction from the depot. The train whistled. "I hope," said I wickedly, as White and I climbed upon the car platform, "that the dog will be hard to catch." Just as the train began to move, Jenkins, red-faced and bareheaded, sank into the seat before us. "Well," he panted triumphantly, "I caught him, but I had to fight the dog and cat, too." Our route lay via Pittsburgh, Chattanooga, and Macon to St. Augustine. At Pittsburgh we caught the through train for St. Augustine. "I don't see why it is, White," said I, after we had been traveling for some time through the mountains of Tennessee, "that these regions are so sparsely settled. Here is land suited to all tastes. If these fertile valleys lay further north, they would be waving with abundant harvest. If further north, these hillsides would be clothed with flocks and herds, and these mountains would be honeycombed by the miner's shaft. Yonder mountain torrent might be turning many a wheel. These wooded heights could supply timber for a nation. "Why don't folks come here to live?" asked Jenkins, much puzzled. "Many are ignorant of Southern advantages," said White. "Some of the Northern people think that because Kentucky and Tennessee are in the South, therefore the climate is exceedingly hot." "I wish they might get a whiff of this mountain air just now," I interposed. "However, I think that which prejudices most people against the South, if indeed they are prejudiced, is not the climate, nor the ignorance of Southern advantages, but the unsettled condition of Southern affairs, political, social, and financial." "I'd like to see the investment of a fair amount of Northern capital here, if only as an experiment," suggested White. "I believe that such an investment would do much to promote a kindly feeling between the two sections of the country. It would give stability to Southern enterprise and confidence in Southern commerce." "Let us take note of some of the chief resources as we proceed upon our camping trip," said I to White. "Perhaps some of our diversions will make us unconsciously aware of them," he replied. Soon conversation lagged, and hour after hour we gazed silently at the swift-passing landscape. Across dizzy trestles and into the blackness of murky tunnels we plunged, the train swaying and creaking under the strain of sharp curves and high rate of speed. Through the dark shade of forest, and out again among the broad savannas and flower-spangled fields, beside cool lakes that listlessly lapped their white-sanded shores and gleamed like molten brass in the morning sun, with a cabin here and cotton field there, and an orange grove in the interval, rushed the famous Southern Flyer, belching volumes of sooty smoke and shrieking through the quiet farmlands like pandemonium let loose. As time passed, the scenes became monotonous. Only here and there an object attracted our attention. Then all objects blur. The rattle of the train becomes indistinct. We rouse up to find that we have been dozing. End of section 6. Chapter 7. A Day in St. Augustine. "Did you say that we are to spend but one day in St. Augustine?" said I, as we alighted from the train. "Why, it will take several days to see all the points of interest." "But we came to camp out, not to tire ourselves with sightseeing," replied White. "If you knew the price of hotel accommodations, I think you would change your several days plan. At any rate, we can judge more accurately how long it will take us after we have started. Come, the day is yet new. Let us away to the plaza." "Afoot or by carriage?" "By carriage. A great suggestion from one who is trying to rough it." "No, the distance is not great. We shall walk." "Wait for Tiger and me," pleaded Jenkins, who seemed to be vainly striving to recall something. "Brother," I exclaimed impatiently, "what do you want of him, anyhow?" But Jenkins was gone, and there was no choice but to wait. At last we were started, and an impossible array we must have made. 3 soldiers bold and a yellow dog. 1,000 times that day I wished that the one who had curtailed the dog had begun at the other end of the cur's anatomy. Oblivious of my untoward desires, Tiger was reveling in his newly found liberty, chucked full of canine joy from heart to bark. He careered about Jenkins like a steam merry-go-round, winding Jenkins in the chain, tripping up passing pedestrians, and getting in everybody's way. 10 minutes' walk brought us to the plaza, where we threw ourselves upon a rustic seat to enjoy the refreshing shade. Jenkins hitched Tiger to a tree before he dared to give heed to his surroundings. "What's that over there?" said Jenkins at length, indicating with his forefinger a white pillared building open at the sides. "That's what is sometimes called the Slave Mart," quoth White. "What do they call it?" "Look at Tiger," I interposed. "He's chewing up that tree, and here comes a copper." Jenkins made a lunge for the dog. "Let's hurry across to the cathedral," suggested White. "Perhaps the policeman has not noticed us yet." Jenkins was not loath to be gone. The cathedral reached, and no one interposing, we stationed Jenkins and Tiger in a shadowy corner of the vestibule, while White and I proceeded to explore the nave. As our eyes became more accustomed to the dim light, we began to discern some of the paintings which graced the walls. I knew that White had very decided artistic tastes. He seemed to be studying some of the scenes from the Passion Week. I knew nothing of sacred art, and cared little for it, but I ventured to ask my companion how he liked the pictures. "I don't like them." "Aren't they well painted?" "Yes, fairly well. But what I object to is the artist's ideal." I waited silently for him to proceed. "Just see how the chief figure in all these paintings is depicted. Everywhere he is portrayed as a suffering, rejected, maltreated man. His face is furrowed with anguish. His brow is gory or covered with bloody sweat. While not wishing to minimize his sufferings, I believe that a great mistake is made by choosing only scenes from the Passion Week. I'd like to see depicted somewhere hereabout the radiant Christ. I'd show him as he appeared transfigured, or as he said, 'It is I, be not afraid,' or as he stretched out his hands to bless his disciples and was thus parted from them. I'd picture him in all the nobility of perfect manhood, in the power of omnipotence, the majestic sweetness of infinite love, the effulgence of divine glory." "It's a pity you were not an artist, or a preacher," I laughed. "Perhaps that copper has forgotten Jenkins by this time. Shall we venture forth again?" My companion glanced for a moment at the far end of the room, where an embankment of snowy marble, brilliant with lighted candles, faded into the shadows of the dark-tinted gable. Then he drew a long breath and said, "I'm ready." Along Charlotte Street, with its quaint white-plastered houses and high-walled gardens, then eastward along a yet narrower street we hastened, Tyga in the lead, closely followed by Jenkins. A half-hour sped quickly amid the curious of the Vetter Museum. Then, having partaken of a lunch at a nearby restaurant, we sauntered leisurely toward the grounds of the Ponce de Leon. Here White insisted upon leaving us, in order that he might complete arrangements for our trip. He had scarcely gone when Jenkins announced his determination to return to the depot. "What's the matter, Jenkins?" said I. "You're not sick?" "Doggone it, Tiger has taken his exercise at my expense, I fear." "Well, I'll see you at train time." When they had gone, I threw myself down upon a stone seat in a cool corridor overlooking an inner court of the Ponce de Leon. In a dream-like stupor, I languidly drank in the beauty of the scene. The patch of sky visible above the court is of as delicate and stainless a blue as that which arches above Seville or Madrid, thought I. Against this bit of sky as a background rose domes and pinnacles, fair visions in gray stone and red tiling. Lost in vague fancies, I fell to wondering what the scene lacked to make it genuinely Spanish. In yonder tower, I mused, near the top is an arched window opening upon a balcony, where, at the appointed hour, I might expect to hear the muezzin's call to prayer. The breeze that blows along this corridor is as balmy as the spice-laden zephyr which fans the Mediterranean. The fountain yonder in the court plays as fitfully and sparkles as delightfully as did any fountain in old Granada. By its side springs the jasmine, the oleander, the palm. The heavy aroma of 1,000 flowers is in the air. Yonder flits the blue-hued cardinal, and among the thick leaves of the fig tree the mocking-bird will sing its vesper hymn. Had I but a few ruins here to feed my fancy, I'd people this place with the lords and ladies of long ago. I'd have this colonnade resounding with the tread of armed men, while every room and passageway would be rich in treasured legend, every court and pillar would bear the name and escutcheon of some doughty warrior of the past. Ah, time, thou art the great romancer. Without thy transforming touch, the graceful pillar, the tessellated floor, the marble basin are but commonplace and low. I was aroused from my reverie by White's return. "Why, old man, have you been asleep?" he said. "I may have dozed a little," said I, viewing him with drowsy eyes. "Dozed a little? If you knew how I have been shaking you for the last 2 minutes, you'd say it was a pretty heavy doze. I hope that you are rested sufficiently so that you can enjoy Fort Marion this afternoon. What time does our train start?" "It is scheduled to leave at 6:15. That'll give us 2 hours at Fort Marion if we hasten." "How much will it give us if we don't hasten?" returned I, rising lazily. "You don't look extremely ambitious, that's a fact," laughed White. "Nor do I feel so." Proceeding up St. George Street, we caught a glimpse of the old city gateway, with a remnant of the wall. Then down we swept upon the fort. After exploring the room from which 2 famous Seminole chiefs made their escape, we joined a party which the guide seemed about to conduct through the far-famed dungeon. The guide stood parleying about his reliability and the great accommodation he was showing, until a portly gentleman of the party slipped $1 into the not unwilling hand. Then the procession started, the guide and the portly gentleman in the lead. Through a shadowy room, and then through a narrow passageway, plunged the procession. At the end of the passageway the guide disappeared through a door, if indeed an opening 2 feet square could be dignified by that term. The portly gentleman was bidden to follow the guide, but weighty objections were offered. Finally, by dint of much urging on the part of the guide, and much kicking, puffing, and shuffling on the part of the portly gentleman, the deed was done. A rubicund face, wet with moisture, showed through the gloom next to the face of the guide. One by one, nearly the whole party scraped through the opening in the wall, and dropped to the ground some 5 feet below. "What if you all was 'ere for keeps?" said the guide, showing his first appreciation of the humor of the situation by a slight twitching of the ends of his mustache. "Don't they tell some frightful stories about skeletons they found when the dungeon was discovered?" queried one of the ladies, who had contented herself with remaining above at the opening, and was now straining her eyes to see all that was revealed by the small circle of light from the torch in the murky blackness. "Oh, Bess, don't ask such questions, or I'll faint," responded another feminine voice. "Well, now," began the guide with his characteristic drawl, "I ain't much on stories, but," he added with a twinkle in his eye, looking toward the fair auditors above, "they do tell that the Spanishes had several iron cages hung up around the wall, and skeletons." Here a piercing shriek interrupted the speaker, and feminine heads were hastily withdrawn from our view. Then, seeing that the portly gentleman betrayed interest, the guide proceeded to relate a harrowing tale of what he had heard from a former guide. The dank, murky air seemed to lend color to the tale, and after a moment of gruesome silence, an unnatural voice above our heads exclaimed, "Oh, Arthur, hadn't you better come back now?" Our stout friend, perhaps remembering the figure he had cut while entering the dungeon, politely insisted that the rest of the party should precede him. As we emerged into the outer light, we heard sundry grunts and sounds of scraping and shuffling, which proceeded from the mouth of the dungeon. "That's the haunt," our guide told us about," said I. "Undoubtedly," laughed White. "Come, let us take a look at the harbor while the guide is extricating the lost spirit from his prison house. May all the shades help him." Mounting a watchtower that was scarred by many a hostile shot, we gazed skyward and seaward. The ocean was a dazzling sheen of sunlit crests and mirror-like troughs. Fascinated, I watched the eager onslaught of the waves upon the unyielding sea-wall. "Anastasia Island," said White, pointing to a luxuriant oasis in the waste of the waters. Thither numerous waterfowl were winging their course. Snow-white cranes, noisy geese, herons, snipe, and an endless variety of fishing birds. With clamorous flight they were early seeking shelter, and soon the island was alive with fluttering, screaming, restless rest-seekers. With every new arrival there was a local stir, perhaps a short encounter if quarters were too crowded, the vanquished seeking other accommodations. Gradually the arrival of flocks lessened in frequency, and as the sun sank lower, quiet prevailed upon the island, save for the outcry of some malcontent who found himself uneasily perched and must needs jostle and flutter a little to see that he had his full share of the tree. The dying breeze wafted to shore boats laden with pleasure-seekers and fishermen. White watched them thoughtfully. "A penny for your thoughts," said I, noting the faraway look in his eyes. "You value them too highly. I was just thinking over some of my past experiences. Years of youth are much like the boats you see yonder. Flitting like white-sailed ships they come, and when seen near at hand, some are found to be laden to the water's edge with sorrow and hardship, while others shall haste joyously over the bounding billows to pour a gleaming cargo of blessings upon the white sands of a pure life." "May yours ever be the latter sort," I exclaimed. "Thanks, old man, but it takes both kinds to make manhood." Silently we watched the sun until it was a great ball of fire cooling itself in the ocean, and dazzling the eyes of curious onlookers by a path of gold leading far, far away to where the sea melted into the stainless blue of the summer sky. There, far out of the sight of man, the sun would dip himself among the mosses and coral reefs, and lave his fevered brow after the weary day. "Come," said White finally, "we must go now, or miss our train." "By the way," said my companion, as we were turning from the fort, "if anyone is looking for a sermon in stone, yonder is a good one." "I see a fig tree growing out of the wall of the fort," I replied, "but where's the sermon?" "The sermon must be in yourself, I suppose." It impressed me that the fig tree by its silent natural growth had accomplished what all the old-time cannon with their noise and bluster had failed to do. For you see that the wall of the fort is crumbling. "Well, White, I guess that I'll look for the fig trees and let you look for the sermons. I've always had considerable sympathy for the materialistic man who thought he had found a printer's blunder, declaring that anyone should know that no sane author intended to write sermons in stones and books and running brooks, but what was intended was sermons in books and stones and running brooks. Save the rest of your jokes, and I'll save my sermons until after we have caught the train." Thus my companion as we hurried from the fort. End of section 7.